The calm before the storm. The Crossroads truck stop, nestled off the beaten path along Interstate 40, wasn't anything special in the grand scheme of the world. To most travelers, it was just another rest stop, a place to refuel, grab a bite, and stretch their legs. The faded neon sign buzzed in the warm evening air, casting a soft glow that illuminated the long line of trucks parked under the sprawling sky. Yet for those who frequented the place, it was more than just a stopover. It was a haven of familiarity and quiet routine. Marcus Davidson sat at his usual spot at the counter. His graying hair, a silent testament to the years he'd spent serving his country, seemed to blend in with the simple surroundings of the truck stop diner. The same quiet routine had settled into his life since he'd left the Marines, but Marcus wasn't the kind of man to speak of his past. He didn't need to. His calm demeanor, the way he scanned his surroundings, and his methodical approach to every detail told a story that words never could. Jenny Thompson, the waitress, knew him well. She had worked at Crossroads for years, and Marcus had become a fixture in her life. He was always polite, always thankful, and always there with a warm smile that made even the longest days a little brighter. As she poured him another cup of coffee, she couldn't help but notice that there was something about him, a quiet strength that emanated from the man. He didn't need to advertise who he was. It was written in the way he carried himself, in his readiness to defend the things that mattered. Tonight, however, the air felt different. The evening sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as the last truckers settled in for the night, and Marcus, methodically reviewing his route maps, felt a shift in the atmosphere. He didn't look up from his work, but his senses, finely tuned over years of service, were already alert. The rumble of motorcycles broke the calm, their engines loud enough to make the truckers stir in their seats. It wasn't just the sound that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way the bikes were revving, loud and intentionally aggressive. Two men dismounted, their leather vests adorned with patches that were unmistakable. Marcus had seen it all before. The Road Wolves MC. The men didn't belong here. This wasn't their territory. And yet they were making their presence felt, every bit of it calculated, every step a move in their territorial game. Jenny's hand trembled as she set the coffee pot down on the counter. She didn't say anything at first, but her pale face spoke volumes. "Those are the ones Beth warned us about," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the reflection in the chrome of the coffee machine. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. Small gangs moving into quiet communities, testing the waters, flexing their muscles, and intimidating those who were too afraid to stand up. This was the first move in what he knew would be a campaign of intimidation, and ultimately, control. He glanced toward Jenny and gave her a reassuring nod. "It's all right, Jenny. Just keep calm. Let me handle this." As the door opened, the two bikers swaggered into the diner. The taller one, with a graying beard and cold eyes, was the first to speak. His voice oozed arrogance. "Well, ain't this cozy?" he drawled, his eyes scanning the room. "Real nice setup you got here." Beth Morrison, the owner of Crossroads, appeared from the kitchen. Her face was neutral, but Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders. He had seen enough to know that Beth, a quiet woman in her own right, wasn't used to confrontation. But she was no fool. She knew exactly who these men were and what they represented. "Welcome to Crossroads," Beth said, her voice steady but not without an edge. "What can I get you gentlemen?" The younger one, snake tattooed up his neck, leaned against the counter, his eyes cold and predatory. "How about everything in the register for starters?" The room tensed, the few truckers in the diner sitting up straighter, their eyes darting toward the bikers and back to Marcus. It was as if they were waiting for the storm to break, unsure of how it would unfold but knowing something had to give. The tension was palpable, but Marcus didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He remained still, his eyes locked on the bikers, his mind already calculating the best course of action. He had seen this before. He knew how these types worked. The intimidation was the first step, but the real goal was always control, dominance, and Marcus knew, without a doubt, that he couldn't let this happen. "Everything in the register," Beth repeated, her voice firm, though her fingers hovered near the counter, close to where she kept a baseball bat, a silent symbol of the defense she was prepared to offer her business. The taller biker, Hammer, grinned. "You see, sweetheart, this stretch of highway is under new management. Road wolves are expanding, and we're here to talk about your monthly protection fees." It was clear now. This wasn't just a random act of intimidation. This was calculated, and it was only the beginning. Marcus had lived through this in his time with Force Recon. He had fought cartels and dismantled organizations across 3 continents. He knew how to recognize the signs of a gang making a move, and he wasn't about to sit by and let them take over a place he considered home. It wasn't just about the money. It was about something much bigger: community. He set his coffee cup down gently, his movements calm and deliberate. His voice cut through the rising tension. "The lady said she's not interested," he said evenly, his eyes never leaving Hammer. Hammer's eyes narrowed. He seemed to size Marcus up for the first time, his earlier bravado faltering slightly as he realized that this wasn't some ordinary trucker sitting at the counter. This man wasn't afraid. "Is that so?" Hammer sneered, taking a step toward Marcus. "And just who do you think you are?" Marcus met his gaze steadily, his voice low but carrying the weight of his years of service. "Just a guy trying to enjoy his coffee. But I've got a pretty good idea who you are. Road wolves, moving up from Texas, trying to establish new territory. You start with intimidation. You move on to protection rackets. And then you get into drugs." A silence fell over the diner as everyone waited for Hammer's response. Snake, the younger biker, stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his belt. But before he could make a move, Marcus spoke again, his tone unwavering. "2 choices, gentlemen. You can get on your bikes and ride out of here, or you can try whatever you're thinking about trying, and we'll see how that works out for everyone." The calmness in Marcus's voice, the certainty that radiated from him, gave Snake pause. Even Hammer, who had been the one to lead the charge, seemed to hesitate for a moment. This was more than just a fight for control. This was a stand against the kind of oppression that Marcus had fought against his entire life. He had fought for freedom, for the right to live without fear. And he wasn't about to let these 2 bikers, or anyone else, take that away from the people of Crossroads. Hammer stepped back, his eyes narrowing in a mix of frustration and calculation. "This ain't over," he muttered, before turning toward the door. Marcus simply nodded, not needing to say anything more. As the bikers retreated, the tension in the diner began to dissipate, but the reality of what had just happened wasn't lost on anyone. The threat had been real, and it was far from over. But Marcus had made a stand. He had shown them that this place, this community, wouldn't just roll over. Beth approached Marcus, her voice shaky but grateful. "Thank you for what you did," she said quietly. Marcus gave a small smile, his eyes scanning the room, aware of the collective breath everyone had just let out. "You're welcome," he replied simply. "But it's not over yet." He turned to Jenny, who had been watching in silence. "Call Sheriff Cooper. Let him know what just happened. This isn't going to be the last time they come around." As the door chimed and the bikers roared away, Marcus settled back into his seat, his coffee still warm. He knew that the road wolves would be back, and next time, they wouldn't come alone. But that was fine. He was ready. The quiet, calm man at the counter wasn't just a veteran. He was the first line of defense in a fight for something much bigger than any gang could ever hope to control. And Marcus Davidson wasn't about to back down. The line in the sand. The morning after the incident with the road wolves, Crossroads truck stop had a different air about it. The warm light of dawn was spilling over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the parking lot. The usual trucks were parked in neat rows, and the hum of the early morning traffic from the interstate was just beginning to pick up. But beneath the surface, something was different. The community that had once quietly moved through its daily routines now carried a new sense of purpose. Marcus Davidson sat at his usual spot at the counter once again, the worn leather jacket draped over his chair, and the remnants of his map spread out before him. His calm demeanor hadn't shifted. There was no sign of tension in his posture or the way he held himself. But beneath that stillness, he was already thinking several moves ahead. He knew the road wolves would be back, and this time, they would come with more than just threats and intimidation. It wasn't enough to turn them away once. He needed to prepare not just for their return, but for the fight that would follow. Jenny, her apron still on from her shift, came over to refill his coffee. Her hands were steady now, but the tremor from the night before hadn't completely left her. "Here you go, Marcus," she said, her voice softer than usual, as if speaking in reverence to the man who had stood up against the bikers. "Thanks, Jenny," Marcus replied, his voice calm and steady. "You did good last night. You didn't panic." Jenny smiled slightly, though it was a thin, uncertain smile. "I don't know what would have happened if you weren't here. You would have handled it just fine," Marcus assured her. "You've got more strength than you know." As Jenny moved away, Marcus's eyes scanned the diner. It was a quiet morning so far, but the unease was palpable. Beth, behind the counter, had her back to the room, but Marcus noticed how she kept glancing toward the door. It wasn't fear. It was vigilance, the kind of watchful presence that someone who had lived through their own battles carried with them, even when they weren't in immediate danger. The door chimed, and in walked Sheriff Tom Cooper, his boots heavy on the floor as he made his way to the counter. He wasn't wearing his uniform yet, but his presence still commanded authority. His face was weathered from years of working the streets, but it was the eyes, sharp, discerning, that gave him away as someone who had seen enough of the world to know when things were about to go sideways. "Morning, Marcus," Tom said as he settled into the stool next to him. "I heard about last night. Thought I'd swing by. See how you're holding up." "Same as usual," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving the window. He didn't need to look at Tom to know he was there. Marcus's senses were always on high alert, and he could feel the shift in the air when the sheriff had entered. "You know how it goes. They won't stop at just one visit." "You're right about that," Tom said, his voice low but firm. "We've been keeping an eye on them. I've heard whispers that the road wolves are gearing up for something bigger. They're not going to let a few bruises from last night stop them, but we need to be ready. And we need to do more than just talk." Marcus nodded, his gaze still fixed on the parking lot outside, but his mind was already in motion, connecting the dots. "We will be. This isn't just about us or this truck stop. This is about sending a message to them, and anyone else who thinks they can just walk into this community and take what they want." Beth walked over to join them, setting down a fresh pot of coffee. She was more composed now, though her eyes still held a trace of concern. "What's the plan, Marcus?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a determination behind her words. "How do we stop them from coming back? And how do we protect ourselves?" Marcus met her gaze, his expression steady and unyielding. "We show them they've picked the wrong place to mess with. We show them that this isn't just a truck stop. It's a community, and we're not just a bunch of easy targets. We're not afraid to fight back." Tom nodded in agreement. "I'm not going to lie to you, Marcus. They'll come in force next time. We can't just rely on our own manpower. We need backup. And I'm not talking about just the local deputies. This has gotten bigger than that. We're going to need some reinforcements." Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze shifting back to the maps he had spread out earlier. "I've got some people I can call. People who know how to handle themselves. We're going to turn this place into a fortress." As if on cue, the sound of motorcycles rumbled in the distance, and Marcus's attention snapped to the window. He didn't need to look twice to recognize the unmistakable roar of the road wolves' bikes. The rumble grew louder, coming closer. But this time, it wasn't just two bikes. This time, there were at least a dozen. "They're here," Marcus muttered, his voice low, as if he were speaking to himself. "Time to put our plan into motion." The door swung open, and Hammer led the pack of bikers into the diner, his presence almost overwhelming as he strode through the door, flanked by several new faces. The air seemed to grow heavier with each step they took, the tension building to a near breaking point. "Back again, huh?" Hammer sneered, his eyes scanning the room. He took in the sight of Marcus at the counter, his gaze narrowing in recognition. "I told you last night, old man, this ain't over." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving Hammer's face. The other bikers fanned out behind him, their eyes scanning the room, looking for weakness, searching for fear. But what they saw wasn't fear, it was resolve. "Marcus," Tom said quietly, his hand resting near his sidearm. "I've got a couple of deputies on standby, but we're outnumbered. You sure you're ready for this?" Marcus met his gaze, his voice steady. "We'll make it through. We have to. But this time, we won't just defend. This time, we take the fight to them." The air was thick with tension as the bikers approached the counter, their boots heavy on the floor. Hammer stepped forward, his cold eyes locked onto Marcus. "So you really think you can stop us?" he sneered. "You're out of your league, old man." Marcus stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, it carried weight. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't about stopping you. This is about ending what you're doing. And that means you're not just fighting me or these truckers. You're fighting this entire community." The bikers froze for a moment, caught off guard by Marcus's words. It wasn't the challenge they expected. They had come here to take what they wanted, to intimidate and bully, but now they were facing something they hadn't anticipated. They weren't facing one man. They were facing a united front, a community that had decided it wasn't going to back down. "You don't know what you're up against," Hammer muttered, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "We've got more people, more power. And we got something you'll never have," Marcus replied. "We've got each other." Before Hammer could respond, there was a subtle shift in the room. The regulars, the truckers, the people who had been quietly sitting at their tables, began to move. Big Steve adjusted his position slightly, a silent warning. Doc Wilson stood a little straighter. The message was clear. The line had been drawn, and no one was backing down. "Make your move," Marcus said quietly. "But know this, you're not welcome here, and we're not leaving." The road wolves exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this kind of resistance, and that was when they realized they had made a grave mistake. They had thought this was just another truck stop, another place to intimidate and control. But Crossroads wasn't just any truck stop. It was a fortress, and it was guarded by something stronger than any gang. It was guarded by a community that wasn't afraid to stand together, united by a bond forged through shared experiences and unshakable loyalty. The road wolves would soon learn that they had chosen the wrong place and the wrong veterans to mess with. The call to action. The tension in Crossroads truck stop was like a live wire, humming with the knowledge that something big was about to happen. It wasn't the kind of fight anyone had expected when they first moved to this quiet stretch of Interstate 40. For the regulars who came here, it was a place where the biggest worries were running low on coffee or finding an empty parking spot for the night. But now, the stakes had shifted dramatically. Marcus Davidson knew this battle wasn't just about saving a truck stop. It was about something bigger, a fight for the very heart of the community. The road wolves had thought they could waltz in, establish their dominance, and terrorize everyone into submission. But they hadn't counted on one thing. This was a place built on solidarity, on strength forged by years of quiet persistence, and by a group of veterans who knew how to fight back when the time came. The first signs of that unity were already taking shape as the bikers made their move. They had gathered in force the night before, but today was different. Today, The community had decided it wouldn't simply retreat or surrender. Today, they were going to push back. Marcus was the calm at the center of the storm. He knew that in order to win, he couldn't just rely on his own strength. He had spent years training and fighting with some of the world's most elite forces, but even he understood that no battle could be won by a single individual. A battle won by a lone warrior was a fleeting victory, but a victory won by a community could change the course of everything. The morning light was creeping across the diner's floor when Marcus turned to Sheriff Tom Cooper. The man had been a solid ally from the beginning, but Marcus knew that the real work wasn't about standing behind a badge. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder with the people you cared about. And that's what Marcus was counting on. "We're not just defending a building," Marcus said quietly, his voice firm with the weight of the coming battle. "We're defending everything that makes this community what it is. That's why we need more than just muscle. We need intelligence. We need eyes on every corner." Sheriff Cooper nodded. His eyes darkened with concern. "I've got 2 deputies who'll back you up. But I'm not going to lie. We're up against a lot more than we thought. This is no longer just about taking down a gang. It's about dismantling an entire operation." Marcus didn't flinch. He'd seen operations far more dangerous than the road wolves. This was nothing new to him. "Then we do it the way we've always done it," he replied. "Slow, methodical, and above all, together." Before Cooper could respond, the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles interrupted their conversation. It wasn't just 1 or 2 bikes this time. The sound was deeper, more numerous. Marcus felt his muscles tense, but his expression didn't change. This was it. The moment they had been preparing for was here. From the window, Marcus saw the approaching swarm. There were at least 20 bikes, all coming from the south, their engines roaring as they kicked up dust along the parking lot. This wasn't just a show of force. It was a calculated strike. The road wolves weren't here to negotiate anymore. They were here to take what they wanted. Marcus turned back to the group gathered in the diner, his voice calm but carrying the authority of a man who had spent years in some of the most dangerous operations on the planet. "They're here. It's time to put the plan into motion. Remember, we stay focused. No one takes unnecessary risks, and no one acts alone." The room was silent, but it wasn't a fearful silence. It was a determined one. The truckers who had gathered, all veterans in their own right, exchanged nods of solidarity. They had known each other for years, but this was the first time they were being called to action together, as a unified force. Each of them had been touched by the ravages of war. Each had their own scars, some physical, others emotional. But they shared one thing in common: the willingness to protect those they cared about, no matter the cost. Outside, the bikers were getting closer, their bikes lining up in the parking lot. The air was thick with tension. Big Steve Johnson, the former Army Ranger who had been one of the first to rally to Marcus's side, stood up slowly from his seat near the door. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire space, but it wasn't just his size that commanded attention. It was the way he carried himself, a quiet, unshakable confidence born from years of combat experience. "You all ready for this?" Big Steve asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of a man who had faced death more times than he cared to count. "Ready," Doc Wilson, the combat medic, said firmly. He adjusted his glasses and gave a small nod. "Let's show them what happens when you mess with the wrong community." The bikers were now stepping off their bikes, their heavy boots hitting the pavement with a sound that seemed to reverberate through the diner. Hammer, the leader of the road wolves, stepped forward with Snake and Brick flanking him. This time, the number of bikers who followed them was far greater than the night before. Their faces were grim, their body language aggressive. "You really think you can stop us?" Hammer sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing, as he took in the sight of the truckers and the few regular customers who had stayed behind. Marcus didn't flinch. He met Hammer's gaze with the same unyielding calm that had defined him throughout this entire situation. "You don't get to intimidate anyone here," he said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't your territory, and it's never going to be." "Is that right?" Hammer's voice was low, almost mocking. "You think you can take us all on, old man?" Marcus stood slowly, deliberately, and the room seemed to hold its breath. There was a quiet power in his movements, a confidence that came from years of experience, not just in battle but in life. He stepped forward, placing himself between the bikers and the other truckers, his gaze never wavering. "I'm not alone in this," Marcus said simply. "You've got one choice. Leave, or you can test us. But know this, you're not just fighting me. You're fighting every person in this room, every person in this town. We've been through too much to let people like you walk in here and take what's ours." The bikers hesitated. The challenge had been laid out, and it was one they hadn't expected. They had assumed that Crossroads would be an easy target, that they could bulldoze their way through without resistance. But Marcus's words had planted a seed of doubt, and now they were unsure of how to proceed. Hammer looked around at the truckers, at the quiet, determined faces. He recognized the strength in their eyes, the same strength he had seen in his own gang, the kind that didn't back down easily. But this time, it wasn't his gang that had the upper hand. "Get out of here," Marcus said, his voice steady. "You've made your move, but you've picked the wrong place to fight. Crossroads is ours, and as long as we're here, it always will be." The road wolves didn't know what to do. The numbers were on their side, but the unity and resolve of this community were not things they could easily overcome. Hammer hesitated, then shot a glare at Marcus, but the anger in his eyes was laced with something else. Doubt. Finally, with a sharp gesture, Hammer turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he muttered. "You'll regret this. We'll be waiting." Marcus called after him, his voice calm but resolute. As the bikers retreated, the silence in the diner stretched out, only broken by the faint hum of the motorcycles fading into the distance. Inside, the truckers exhaled, the weight of the moment beginning to lift. They had stood their ground. They had defended what was theirs, but Marcus knew this was only the beginning. "They'll be back," Marcus said quietly, as he turned to the group gathered in the diner. "Next time, they'll come harder, but we'll be ready." And so, the battle for Crossroads truck stop had truly begun. The road wolves had underestimated what they were up against, but they had no idea what was coming next. Marcus Davidson and the community he had helped to unite were ready to fight, not just for the truck stop, but for the people who called this place home. They had drawn the line in the sand, and they weren't about to let anyone cross it. The calm before the storm. The days following the confrontation with the road wolves were filled with a kind of tense anticipation. Crossroads truck stop, nestled along the quiet stretch of Interstate 40, had always been a place of peace and routine for those who passed through. For years, it had served as a resting point, a safe haven where truckers could refuel both their rigs and their spirits. But now, the very air surrounding the place seemed to crackle with a new energy, a charged kind of calm that comes before the storm. Marcus Davidson was no stranger to this feeling. In his years of service with Force Recon, he had been trained to sense these quiet moments, the brief lulls before things escalated. He had faced enemies far more dangerous and relentless than the road wolves. He knew how quickly the tide could turn and how much preparation was needed in these moments of apparent stillness. What came next would determine not only the fate of Crossroads, but also the larger battle for control over the community's future. Marcus sat in his usual spot at the counter, a cup of coffee in hand, as his eyes scanned the room. It was early, but already the steady hum of activity could be felt. Jenny moved through the diner with practiced ease, refilling cups and chatting with the truckers as they filed in for breakfast. Big Steve, Doc Wilson, and the others were already in their positions, calmly sipping their coffee, each one watching the door with a quiet awareness that hadn't been there just days ago. The truck stop had transformed into something more than just a rest area. It had become the front line of a war, a symbol of resistance against those who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. The sound of a motorcycle approaching broke the rhythm of the morning. Marcus didn't need to look up to know it was Hammer and his crew. The familiar roar of their engines was unmistakable, and the number of bikes was far larger than the day before. Marcus felt the tension rise, but his face remained calm. This wasn't the first time he'd been outnumbered. It wouldn't be the last. Sheriff Tom Cooper walked in just as the first few bikers dismounted. His boots made a quiet but resolute thud against the floor as he made his way to the counter. "Marcus," he said, his voice low but steady. "Looks like they're back in force." Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the door. "They'll keep coming until we stop them," he said, the quiet certainty of his words hanging in the air like a promise. "But this time, it's going to be different. We're ready." Tom took a seat beside him, his eyes scanning the bikers as they started to fill the diner, moving with the kind of aggression that made everyone else in the room tense. The group of bikers who had walked in yesterday with just a few members now seemed to have tripled in size. Hammer led the group, flanked by Snake, Brick, and several others who had clearly been recruited from across the region. The road wolves were making their move, and they had come with a clear message. This truck stop was theirs now. But Marcus wasn't concerned with their threats. His mind was already several steps ahead. He had spent the night reviewing his plans, making sure every detail was covered. He had reached out to his network of fellow veterans, old contacts from his days with the military, truckers who shared his commitment to protecting what mattered. Together, they had formed a tight-knit web of intelligence, ready to stand their ground when the time came. "Here's the deal," Marcus said, turning to Tom, his voice calm but resolute. "We're not going to give them an inch. We need to make sure they know that Crossroads is off-limits, that we're not backing down. But we also need to make sure the civilians here stay safe. No one gets hurt." "I'm with you," Tom said, his voice unwavering. "We've got the manpower, but it's going to be a tough fight. They've been moving in from Texas, and I've heard rumors about their ties to bigger operations. This isn't just a gang anymore. This is an organized effort." Marcus nodded, his mind already working. "We've got to hit them where it hurts. Intelligence is key. We need to track their movements, get a sense of where they're coming from, and where they're going next. The more we know, the better we can plan for when they come in full force." As the bikers continued to fill the diner, Marcus remained calm. He didn't flinch when Hammer walked in, his cold eyes scanning the room. The older biker's face was a mask of frustration, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something Marcus recognized. It wasn't just anger. It was uncertainty. Hammer had expected the truck stop to fall without a fight. He had thought the people here would cower, that they would pay the protection fees and accept their place under the Road Wolves' rule. But Marcus had changed the game. The resistance was growing, and the bikers knew they had underestimated the resolve of those they thought were easy targets. "Marcus Davidson," Hammer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I should have known it was you. You really think you can stop us?" "I don't think," Marcus replied evenly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years planning and executing operations in high-stakes environments. "I know. This is where it ends for you. You've got a lot of people backing you, huh?" Snake, the younger biker, sneered as he stepped forward, his fingers twitching toward the knife at his belt. "You really think they'll fight for you? You really think they'll stand with an old man like you?" Marcus didn't flinch. He had been called worse in his lifetime. "It's not about me," he said, his voice cutting through Snake's taunts like a blade. "It's about this place. It's about this community. And if you want to take it, you'll have to go through every single one of us." The tension in the room was palpable. The bikers, their hands on weapons or close to them, seemed to hesitate for just a moment. This wasn't the easy fight they had expected. The truckers who had gathered in the diner, veterans and everyday workers alike, didn't flinch. Their eyes were steady, their posture unwavering. "Big Steve," Marcus said without looking away from the bikers. "Doc Wilson, take your positions. We're not just defending Crossroads anymore. We're taking it back." Big Steve stood, his massive frame blocking the entrance as he moved toward the door, his eyes scanning the lot for any signs of more bikers approaching. Doc Wilson, the former combat medic, nodded and followed Steve, his movements calm and measured. Hammer and his gang were visibly agitated. They had expected an easy takeover. Instead, they were facing something they hadn't planned for: community unity, strength born from a shared history of struggle and survival. "You're making a mistake, Marcus," Hammer said, his voice dropping low as he took a step closer. "You really think you can stop us?" "I don't think I can," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I know we can. You're not the first group of criminals to try this, and you won't be the last. But it's going to be the last time you mess with Crossroads." The door swung open again, and Sheriff Cooper stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Marcus is right. This place isn't for sale. And neither are the people here. We've got enough people on our side to make sure you don't get another chance." Hammer hesitated, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the lawman. He wasn't used to this kind of pushback. Usually, a few threats were enough to send people cowering in the corner. But Marcus wasn't afraid. The other truckers weren't afraid. And neither was the sheriff. "You've got two choices," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "You leave now, or you deal with the consequences." There was a brief, tense silence as Hammer weighed his options. He had come to assert dominance, to make sure the road wolves had a foothold in this part of the state. But the weight of Marcus's words, and the steady resolve of the people in the diner, made him pause. This wasn't a battle he could win through sheer force alone. Finally, with a sharp motion, Hammer turned toward the door. "This isn't over, Marcus," he snarled. "We'll be back. And next time, we'll be ready." Marcus stood firm, watching as the bikers retreated, their exit marked by the roar of their motorcycles fading into the distance. But as the sound of their engines slowly faded away, a sense of victory settled over the room. Not because the fight was over, but because they had taken the first step in reclaiming their territory. This wasn't just a fight for Crossroads Truck Stop. It was a fight for everything that was worth protecting. And Marcus Davidson knew that no matter how hard the road wolves came back, they had already lost. They had underestimated the strength of a community that wouldn't back down. And that would be their downfall. As the morning sun rose higher over Crossroads, the truck stop became more than just a place to stop for gas. It had become a battleground, a symbol of resistance, and a reminder that when people stand together, no one can take what belongs to them. The road wolves had thought they were targeting an easy mark, but what they had found instead was a force they never could have predicted. And that was just the beginning. Preparing for the storm. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Crossroads Truck Stop, casting a soft glow on the familiar worn countertops and chipped coffee mugs. Yet for those who had witnessed the confrontation with the road wolves, the peaceful morning seemed out of place. The storm that had been brewing for days was far from over, and everyone knew it. Marcus Davidson had seen a lot in his time, but even he couldn't ignore the sense of urgency that filled the air now. The last encounter with the bikers had been a small victory, a warning shot, if you will. But the road wolves weren't just going to turn tail and run. They would regroup, come back stronger, and test the community's resolve once again. Marcus knew this wasn't a one-time fight. It was a battle for the heart of the community, one that would require not just physical strength, but strategy, courage, and the unshakable will of those who believed in protecting their own. Crossroads was more than just a truck stop now. It was a bastion of resistance, a symbol of what it meant to stand up when the odds were stacked against you. Marcus had made it clear to Sheriff Tom Cooper that they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a second. Every detail had to be accounted for, every angle covered, every weak point reinforced. Outside, the sound of another motorcycle rumbled in the distance, but this time it wasn't the road wolves. It was one of the truckers Marcus had called in, a signal that the reinforcements he'd requested were beginning to arrive. The truck stop was becoming something more than a place to stop for fuel. It was transforming into a fortified command center. Inside the diner, things were quieter than they had been during the previous confrontation, but the atmosphere was far from relaxed. Everyone knew that the bikers would be back, and when they came, they would bring more muscle, more firepower, and a lot more determination to take what they thought was theirs. Big Steve Johnson, the towering former Army Ranger, stood by the door, his eyes scanning the parking lot. He had his hand on the edge of his jacket, where he kept a concealed firearm. Not that Big Steve needed a weapon to instill fear. His very presence was enough to make most people think twice. But Marcus had made it clear, this wasn't just about brute force. It was about strategy. Big Steve wasn't just a hammer. He was also a part of the intricate web of defense they were building. Doc Wilson, the combat medic, sat at the counter, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes focused on the map that spread across the table. He had spent the better part of the morning coordinating with other veterans Marcus had contacted. It wasn't just the bikers they had to worry about. It was the network that enabled their drug trade, the silent enablers in the community who were working to ensure the road wolves succeeded. Doc was an expert at reading situations, both in combat and in the quiet moments before violence erupted. "We've got some eyes on their movements," Doc said, his voice steady, a sharp contrast to the tension in the air. "There's a few trucks moving through the area, probably from the road wolves network. We can expect a supply drop sometime tonight. That's when they'll make their move." Marcus nodded as he took a seat at the counter, his hand hovering over his cold cup of coffee. He had been awake for most of the night, speaking to old contacts, reaching out to people who knew how to fight without getting noticed. The community wasn't just standing behind him. They were becoming part of the plan. This was no longer a battle between Marcus and the road wolves. It was a community against a gang, a united front of veterans and everyday people who were committed to protecting the place they called home. "Good," Marcus said, his voice low and thoughtful. "We'll need to be ready. We have to make sure we cut them off before they get too comfortable. If they think they can move in and out without anyone noticing, they're wrong." Tom Cooper had entered quietly, standing near the entrance as he listened to the conversation unfolding around him. He had spent years in law enforcement, but this wasn't the typical kind of case he was used to. This was personal. The road wolves weren't just criminals to him. They were a threat to everything he believed in. They represented a lawlessness that had no place in his community. "They'll be watching us," Cooper said, taking the seat next to Marcus. "They're already scouting. I've had reports of unmarked cars in the area. We need to make sure we don't tip our hand too soon." Marcus looked up at the sheriff, his expression steady. "I'm counting on it. We want them to think we're still in the dark. If they think we're unprepared, they'll make their move. And when they do, that's when we'll strike." The plan wasn't just about brute force or outnumbering the road wolves. It was about control, about drawing them out into the open. The bikers, despite their numbers, were still an organized group, and they couldn't afford to make mistakes. Marcus knew how gangs like them operated. They didn't want to fight on unfamiliar ground. They wanted to move in, intimidate, and control. The moment they felt cornered, they would back off and retreat. That was when they would make their mistakes. "We'll need to keep the civilians out of it," Big Steve said, turning to Marcus. "We can't risk them getting caught in the middle. They're not trained for this kind of fight." "I agree," Marcus said. "We've already warned the regulars. If anyone isn't comfortable with staying, they're free to leave. But for those who stay, they need to know what they're up against. This isn't just about defending a truck stop. It's about defending our way of life." The bell over the door chimed again, and a few more truckers came in, nodding silently to Marcus and the others as they took their seats. Word had spread quickly that things were heating up at Crossroads, and the truckers were coming together. They were more than just drivers. They were a community. They were people who understood what it meant to face danger, to stand tall when the world seemed to be working against them. "Marcus," Jenny said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. She had been standing near the kitchen, her eyes constantly scanning the lot outside. "There's a few more bikes circling. They're getting closer." Marcus stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced out the window. He didn't need to say a word. Everyone knew what was coming. The road wolves had decided to escalate things faster than they had anticipated. "They're here," Marcus said quietly, his tone calm but firm. "Time to make sure they know that this stop is off limits." As the first few bikers rolled into the parking lot, the tension in the diner was palpable. The sound of their engines filled the air, signaling the beginning of the next round. But this time, it wasn't just a few bikers, it was an entire force, a message from the road wolves that they wouldn't back down. Big Steve took his position by the door, Doc Wilson quietly checking his equipment. Sheriff Cooper stood up, his hand resting near his sidearm, but not drawing it. He knew this wasn't a fight that could be won by force alone. It had to be about control, about making sure they weren't caught off guard. "We're not going to give them what they want," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable edge of determination. "This is our home, and if they want it, they're going to have to take it from all of us." Hammer led the pack of bikers into the diner, his eyes scanning the room as he made his way toward the counter. The air seemed to thicken with each step he took. This wasn't the same confident swagger he had had the night before. There was a trace of doubt in his eyes now, a recognition that the game had changed. "Marcus Davidson," Hammer said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You just don't know when to quit, do you?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He simply stood, his hands resting by his side as he looked Hammer squarely in the eyes. "We don't quit, we fight." Hammer smirked, but the smirk didn't reach his eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, the calm before the storm. And this time, when the storm hit, Crossroads would be ready. Outside, the rumble of more motorcycles approaching made the ground shake. The road wolves were about to realize that they had underestimated the strength of this small, tight-knit community. They weren't just fighting one veteran. They were fighting a brotherhood of veterans who had fought too many wars to let anyone take what wasn't theirs. The real battle was about to begin, and Marcus Davidson wasn't going to let anyone stand in the way of what he and his community had built. The siege of Crossroads. The air at Crossroads truck stop had shifted from tense to electric. The once quiet parking lot, now filled with the rumbling of motorcycles and the distant echoes of engines revving, had transformed into something unrecognizable, a battlefield. The familiar din of trucks idling in the lot and the soft hum of conversation inside the diner had all but disappeared. Every person present was focused, eyes scanning the horizon, senses heightened, ready for the storm that was about to descend upon them. Marcus Davidson stood at the front of the diner, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression a study in calm determination. The sound of approaching motorcycles grew louder, vibrating through the concrete and into the soles of his boots. It was like a drumbeat, the thrum of impending violence. But Marcus was unshaken. This wasn't the first time he had faced overwhelming odds, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. This was different, though. This time, he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for the community he had come to call home. Big Steve and Doc Wilson had taken their positions by the door. They were quiet, methodical in their movements, ready for whatever came next. Sheriff Tom Cooper stood with them, his hand hovering near his sidearm, but not yet drawing it. The man understood the importance of keeping calm. It wasn't just about defending the truck stop. It was about outsmarting the road wolves at every turn. Inside, the regular truckers, veterans of wars and hard miles on the road, had gathered, ready to stand firm. These weren't just any truckers. They were former soldiers, combat veterans who had seen the worst humanity could offer and still kept fighting. The resolve in their eyes was unspoken but clear. Crossroads truck stop wasn't just a pit stop for them. It was their home, and they would do anything to protect it. Jenny, The waitress, who had been working at Crossroads for years, moved through the diner with a quiet purpose. Her hands were steady as she refilled coffee mugs, but her eyes never stopped scanning the room, watching for the smallest movement that could signal danger. Her mind was already working, thinking through every possible scenario. Marcus had told her what to do if things escalated, but she wasn't waiting for orders. She knew her role in this battle, and she would play it to perfection. Outside, the first of the Road Wolves bikers had arrived. Hammer, leading the charge, had dismounted from his motorcycle with a cocky swagger. But as he stepped forward into the parking lot, something was different. He could feel it, like an invisible pressure in the air. This wasn't the same quiet truck stop he had expected. It was fortified now, not just by steel and concrete, but by the unwavering determination of the people within it. The Road Wolves were a gang used to taking control of small towns and businesses, spreading fear until people bowed to them. They moved quickly, asserted their dominance, and made it clear that resistance was futile. But they had underestimated something about Crossroads. They had underestimated the heart of its people. And now, as Hammer scanned the parking lot, his gut twisted in an unfamiliar way. This wasn't going to be easy. Hammer wasn't alone. The pack had grown larger, as Marcus had expected. More than 30 bikes now filled the lot, their chrome shining under the midday sun. The Road Wolves had come prepared, armed with chains, bats, and knives. They were ready to intimidate, to show their might, to make sure Marcus and the others knew their place. But there was something in the way the truckers were positioned, standing tall, faces calm, eyes focused. Hammer knew they weren't just standing around. They were waiting for something. Inside the diner, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of conversation as the truckers subtly moved into position. Big Steve had quietly closed the door behind them, and Doc Wilson was monitoring the room, keeping his eyes peeled for any potential threats. Marcus's voice, low but carrying an authority that couldn't be ignored, broke the stillness. "Remember," he said, his gaze sweeping across the group, "we're not just defending this place. We're protecting everything it stands for. We stand together, or we don't stand at all." No one spoke, but the room seemed to draw closer, as if the very words had bound them together, forging an unbreakable bond. The veterans in the room understood what he meant. They knew what it meant to fight for a cause greater than themselves. Outside, Hammer had gathered his men, and now they were walking toward the door of the diner, their boots thudding heavily against the pavement. Snake, the younger biker with the tattoo of a coiling snake on his neck, was the first to step up to the door. He pushed it open with a reckless grin on his face, looking back at his crew. Well, Snake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look who's still here. Didn't think you'd have the guts to face us again." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The calm in his eyes told the story before he even spoke. "This is your last warning. You can leave now, or we'll make sure you regret it." Snake's grin faltered for a moment, but it quickly returned, and he stepped forward. "You think you're in charge here, old man? You think these truckers can stop us? You don't know who we are. We'll burn this place to the ground." "Maybe," Marcus said, his voice as calm as ever. "But it won't be without a fight." Hammer, Snake, and the other bikers stepped into the diner, their presence filling the space with an ominous weight. The air seemed to grow thicker, the tension becoming palpable as every person in the room prepared for the inevitable clash. "Everyone's so quiet," Hammer remarked, surveying the room. "I thought we'd get a better reception, but I guess not. You've got your little circle of truckers, but it's not going to be enough." "That's where you're wrong," Marcus said, his voice never rising above a steady tone. "You're not just facing a group of truckers, you're facing the community. And we won't back down." Hammer's eyes flickered over the faces of the truckers in the room. Big Steve, Doc Wilson, Jenny, Beth, the sheriff. Each one of them seemed to stand just a little taller, a little more resolute than he had expected. This wasn't a simple robbery anymore. This was a battle for control, and the road wolves were beginning to realize they weren't the ones holding the power. Outside, more bikers were circling, revving their engines in a threatening display. The sound reverberated off the diner's walls, the vibrations shaking through the floor. But inside, everything remained still. Every person, every movement was calculated. They were waiting for the first mistake to be made. "We don't want to hurt anyone," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "But if you make us, it won't end well for you." The silence in the room was broken by a sudden burst of sound, the unmistakable scraping of a chair being pushed back. Doc Wilson, the combat medic who had served in multiple combat zones, stood up from his seat and moved toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. His movements were calm, controlled, but there was no mistaking the purpose in his stride. The road wolves weren't just dealing with veterans of war. They were dealing with people who knew how to navigate and survive chaos. "We've been through enough, Hammer," Doc Wilson said quietly, his voice sharp as a knife. "This is where your operation ends." Hammer's jaw tightened as his eyes flickered to the other bikers. The truckers around him stood their ground, every one of them a stone wall. His grip on his bat tightened, but something in the air, the tension, the calm before the storm, made him hesitate. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, especially not with a group like this. The road wolves were waiting for Marcus to make the first move, but Marcus didn't take the bait. He stood there, hands at his sides, allowing the room to hold its breath for what felt like an eternity. His mind was already in motion, calculating the moves, planning the strategy. He knew exactly what would happen next. Hammer's patience finally ran out. He raised his bat and swung it toward Marcus, the motion fast and vicious. But just before it made contact, Big Steve's massive hand shot out, grabbing the bat mid-swing and twisting it out of Hammer's hand with the strength of a freight train. The room exploded into motion as the bikers charged, but they had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the people they had come to intimidate. The truckers weren't just fighting for a stopover on the highway. They were fighting for everything they held dear. They fought with a unity that could not be broken. The clash was chaotic, but it was calculated, every move made with precision. The road wolves were outmatched, outmaneuvered by people who had been trained in the art of survival. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about strategy, about using what you had at your disposal. And Marcus had made sure they were prepared. The road wolves would learn a painful lesson today, one that would echo through the entire region. This wasn't just a battle for Crossroads Truck Stop. It was a declaration that no one, not even the most ruthless gang, could take what belonged to a community that refused to back down. The storm had arrived, and Crossroads was ready for it. The turning tide. The roar of the road wolves' engines, their harsh growls and revs filling the lot, had all but faded into the distance as the first wave of conflict swept across Crossroads Truck Stop. The battle was far from over, but something had shifted, something that hadn't been there before: hope. The kind of hope born from standing together against a common enemy. Marcus Davidson stood tall, his posture unyielding, as the chaos of the fight continued to echo in the walls of the diner. The sounds of fists meeting flesh, grunts of effort, and the metallic clang of weapons hitting the ground filled the air. Yet Marcus remained still, focused, his mind already moving past the immediate confrontation and calculating the next steps. This fight was only the beginning of what was to come. As Hammer and the other bikers had surged forward with chains, bats, and knives, the truckers and veterans of Crossroads had moved as one, their years of training and experience in combat translating into a smooth, practiced defense. What was happening wasn't just a fight. It was a statement. The road wolves had barged into their lives expecting easy domination, but they hadn't counted on the quiet strength of a community united by shared experiences. Big Steve's massive frame had been the first line of defense, effortlessly blocking the path of one of the bikers trying to charge at Marcus. A swift punch sent the biker sprawling, and Steve was already back on his feet, positioning himself near the door to prevent any of the bikers from escaping. Doc Wilson, the ever-watchful combat medic, had quickly neutralized any threats that moved too quickly toward the civilian truckers, his quick thinking ensuring that everyone in the diner stayed safe. Outside, the situation was no less tense. Hammer, Snake, and the rest of the road wolves had been thrown off balance by the unexpected unity of the Crossroads crew. The bikers weren't used to fighting people who didn't back down, who weren't intimidated by their threats or posturing. They had expected to overwhelm a small, vulnerable establishment, but instead they had walked into a hornet's nest. Snake was the first to realize the shift in momentum. The cocky grin that had once sat on his face was replaced by a sneer of frustration as he tried to rally his comrades, but even his own people were hesitating. The bikers, now uncertain, exchanged uneasy glances, their aggression faltering. "Come on," Snake shouted, shaking his head in disbelief. "What's wrong with you? They're just a bunch of old men and truckers. We outnumber them. We're stronger." But the words fell flat. It was clear now to everyone involved that the road wolves had miscalculated. This wasn't just a truck stop. It was a place where people fought for each other, a place where unity ran deeper than any fear the bikers could instill. Hammer, still recovering from the disarm that Big Steve had delivered with a single powerful move, took a step back. His anger had reached its peak, and yet he found himself out of options. Crossroads wasn't just another stop on the highway. It was a battlefront, and he hadn't been prepared for what was happening. "This is madness," Hammer muttered to himself, his voice low, more to Snake than anyone else. "We're not winning this. They're organized. They're ready." Snake, still seething, took a step forward. His hands were shaking, the knife he had been wielding now hanging loosely at his side. "We can't back down now," he growled. "We've come too far to lose it all. If we don't take control here, we're done." But even as Snake spoke, the realization was starting to settle in. The road wolves had overplayed their hand. The bikers had come in thinking they would intimidate, but instead they had stirred up a hornet's nest of veterans, truckers, and local allies who had no intention of rolling over. Inside the diner, Marcus remained composed, his eyes locked on Hammer, who was still trying to gather his wits. The older biker's gaze was now filled with a mix of rage and uncertainty. He had seen the resolve in Marcus's eyes the night before, but he hadn't fully understood it. Now he saw the same fire, stronger, more resolute, and far more dangerous than any biker gang could have anticipated. "You don't know what you're messing with, Marcus," Hammer spat, his hands still trembling with adrenaline. "You're just a bunch of old soldiers thinking they can stop us. We have bigger connections than you can even imagine. This is just the beginning." Marcus's voice was calm, unwavering. "I know exactly who you are, Hammer, and I know exactly what you've been doing. But you're right about one thing. It is just the beginning. And the road wolves aren't going to get any further." For a moment, it looked like the tension might snap. Hammer took a step forward, his fists clenched. But before he could make a move, Snake grabbed his arm. "Hold on," Snake hissed, his voice barely audible. "We're losing. We don't have the manpower for this. We need a new plan." Hammer's eyes flickered to the window, and the sight outside made his heart sink. There, in the distance, he could see the lights of several law enforcement vehicles pulling into the lot. The deputies, backed by state troopers, had arrived, and the situation was quickly slipping out of the bikers' control. Tom Cooper, the sheriff, stepped into the diner, his calm, authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. "This is your last chance to leave, Hammer. You've been warned." Hammer's gaze met Marcus's, a tense standoff that could have lasted a lifetime. The weight of the moment settled on both men, Marcus with the calm certainty that had always defined him, and Hammer with the dawning realization that this fight wasn't one they could win. Finally, with a sharp motion, Hammer gestured to the rest of his gang. "We're done here," he muttered. "This isn't over, but it's over for today." The bikers turned and retreated toward their motorcycles, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty in their wake. Their retreat wasn't a victory for the road wolves. It was a retreat. They had underestimated the will of the people they sought to intimidate, and now they were retreating, licking their wounds, and reconsidering their next steps. Outside, the sound of motorcycles roared to life, but this time it was the sound of retreat. Crossroads' truck stop had stood firm, and for the first time, it felt as though the scales had shifted. The power dynamics had been altered. The road wolves weren't the predators they had thought they were. They were just another gang that had picked the wrong fight. Inside the diner, the truckers exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for days. It wasn't over yet, but for now, they had won. Marcus nodded towards Steve, Doc, and Tom, his eyes filled with unspoken gratitude. He had known they could do it, but seeing it unfold, seeing the resolve of everyone involved, had been something else entirely. "This place," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady, "is still ours, and it will be as long as we stand together." The law enforcement had arrived in full force, and the remaining road wolves, once mighty in their numbers, had realized they were now outgunned and outmaneuvered. The game was changing. The tide had turned, and the story of how Crossroads' truck stop had become the front line of a battle against fear and violence would become a legend. A story of a community that refused to bow down. A story of how even the smallest of towns could rise against overwhelming odds. Crossroads gathered, their hearts beating with the unshakable knowledge that they had done what others thought impossible. They had defended their home. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about winning. The last stand. The aftermath of the road wolves' retreat settled into the stillness of Crossroads' truck stop, like the calm after a storm. The sound of revving engines had faded, and with it the heavy weight that had hung over the community for the past few days. The once tense air now felt lighter, though the scars of the battle were still fresh. Inside the diner, the veterans, the truckers, and the townsfolk who had fought so hard to protect what was theirs took a collective breath. They had faced an enemy larger, more menacing, and better equipped than they had expected. Yet they had stood their ground, side by side, and together they had emerged victorious. Marcus Davidson sat at the counter once more, his back to the wall, his usual spot in the diner, now a symbol of something far more important than a place to rest. It had become the heartbeat of a community that had refused to be intimidated. The cup of coffee before him was cold now, but it didn't matter. He had long since stopped needing the caffeine. The energy that had been building inside him, the drive to protect what mattered, had become his fuel. Sheriff Tom Cooper leaned against the counter, his arms folded, his face more relaxed than it had been in days. "I thought for sure it was going to get ugly there for a second," he said, a small chuckle escaping his lips. Marcus gave a small smile, his gaze never wavering from the door. "It almost did, but we held them off. You know, sometimes the best way to win is to make sure they know you're not going to roll over." The diner had slowly started to return to normal. The truckers who had joined in the fight were now scattered across the tables, talking in low voices about what had just transpired. There was no arrogance in their tone, just a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had protected what was important. Jenny walked over to Marcus, her hands shaking slightly as she refilled his coffee cup. "I still can't believe they backed down," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "I thought they'd burn the place down." Marcus turned to her, his face softening. "You were ready, Jenny. You stood your ground. You were ready for anything." She smiled faintly, the strength she had shown in the heat of the moment now becoming more apparent. "Guess I learned something about myself today." "That's the thing," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "We all did. We all learned that when you stand together, there's nothing you can't overcome. Fear isn't what controls you. It's your choice to act, to stand for something that matters." Across the room, Beth Morrison, the owner of Crossroads, wiped her hands on a towel and walked over. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said to Marcus. "I've never seen anything like it. You brought everyone together." Marcus shook his head slightly. It wasn't just me. It was everyone in this room. When the time came, we all made the choice to fight. This isn't just about one person. It's about the strength of this community. The thing is, every one of you chose to protect this place, and that's something you can't underestimate. Beth nodded, the realization settling over her. I guess I thought we were just a quiet truck stop. I didn't know we had this kind of power. That's the lesson, isn't it? Marcus said. We all have something to protect, but we can't do it alone. When we come together, when we fight for each other, we become stronger than any gang, any organization, any force that tries to take us down. Big Steve, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned forward with a grunt. It's like I always said, strength isn't in the size of your fists. It's in your resolve, your willingness to stand for what's right. When you've got a community behind you, there's nothing anyone can do to shake you. Marcus nodded in agreement, his eyes scanning the room, feeling the weight of every word. You've all proven that. The Road Wolves didn't stand a chance because they didn't expect this. They didn't expect us to fight back. They didn't expect us to care enough about each other to make sure they didn't win. Outside, the sky was beginning to turn the color of twilight. The last of the bikers had left, and the calm that followed their departure was a reminder of what had been won, not through violence or intimidation, but through unity and courage. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of peace settled over the town. The people of Crossroads had faced a threat that seemed insurmountable, but through their collective strength and determination, they had turned the tide. The story of the Road Wolves wouldn't end here, but the message had been clear. Crossroads wasn't going to be anyone's victim. Marcus stood from his seat and walked to the door. He pushed it open, letting the cool evening air wash over him. Looking out over the parking lot, he saw the familiar trucks lined up, the glow of the diner's lights reflecting off their polished chrome. It was then that Marcus realized that the battle wasn't just about this one truck stop. It was about every person who had ever felt powerless, about every community that had been targeted by those who thought they could take what didn't belong to them. This wasn't just a victory for Crossroads. It was a reminder to every small town, to every individual, that they could stand up to, that they didn't have to be afraid. You know, Tom Cooper said as he stepped beside Marcus, looking out at the parking lot, I've been thinking, you didn't just fight for Crossroads. You fought for something bigger. You fought for every person who doesn't have a voice. Marcus didn't respond at first. He simply stood there, taking it all in, the victory, the quiet after the storm, and the truth in Cooper's words. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady. It's about doing what's right. It's about knowing when to stand, even when the odds are stacked against you. And when the people around you are with you, you're never really alone. The lesson was simple, yet powerful. The strength of a community is far greater than any individual, and when people come together to fight for what matters, they can accomplish anything. Marcus had been the spark that ignited Crossroads' resistance, but it was the people who stood by him, each one with their own story, their own reason for fighting, that made the difference. And as Marcus watched the final remnants of the Road Wolves fade into the distance, he knew that the fight for Crossroads might never be completely over, but it didn't matter. The community had learned what it meant to fight for one another, and that, in itself, was a victory that no one could ever take away. As the lights of the truck stopped shone in the night, it was clear Crossroads had become something much greater than a stop on the road. It had become a symbol of resilience, of unity, and of the unbreakable strength that arises when people stand together for what's right. And in the end, that was all that mattered. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.